A German shepherd stumbled out from the shadows of a rusted freighter, salt hardened in his coat, one ear bent like a torn banner. He was never supposed to be found. For 3 decades, the Harbor Star had sat forgotten on Charleston's edge, a graveyard of iron and secrets. But on this night, new boot prints scraped across her deck, a hatch gaped open, and deep below the waterline, a story fought against being swallowed forever. Nobody wanted the ship. Nobody expected the dog. But he carried the memory of service, and of what it meant to be saved. What followed would stir tears and awaken faith in second chances. Before we dive in, let me know where you're watching from, drop your country in the comments below. And if you believe no human or animal should be abandoned in darkness, make sure to subscribe. This story may just remind you that miracles are real. Charleston, South Carolina, awoke that autumn morning under a weight of damp chill rising from the Atlantic. The air was thick with the mingled scents of brine, diesel, and decaying timber from the docks. A silver haze hovered low across the port, blurring the outlines of century-old brick warehouses whose shutters had endured countless storms. Waves licked lazily against barnacle-encrusted pylons while gulls circled overhead, their cries sharp and hollow in a harbor only half awake. Beyond the bustle of the historic district, where tourists usually admired cobblestone streets and pastel townhouses, the farthest reaches of the dock belonged to a different world. This was a place of rust and ruin, abandoned and left behind. It was there that Jack Rowan walked, his boots thudding softly against wet pavement, each breath visible in the cold. At 41, he still carried the taut frame of a Marine, though softened by sleepless nights and the weight of joblessness. His shoulders were broad, his spine straight, but his arms hung as though dragged down by invisible weights heavier than any combat pack. His dark brown hair, cropped short more from habit than vanity, was streaked with gray at the temples, not from age but from grief. His jaw was square, once carrying the look of ironclad confidence, but now his blue-gray eyes told a quieter story, a haunted stillness, beware of someone who had endured more than his share. Jack had been a Marine sergeant, a steady leader in the chaos of Afghanistan. He wasn't the loudest or most charismatic, but in battle he was immovable, the kind of man you trusted when everything else collapsed. Yet wars always end, and not every soldier finds his footing afterward. 3 years earlier, tragedy had struck. His wife, Clara, had died suddenly from an illness so swift that doctors had no time to name it. Since then, Jack had drifted, a widower, a soldier without a war, a man without children he and Clara had always longed for. What remained to him were memories, regrets, and a single talisman he carried everywhere, a worn leather collar. It had belonged to Ranger, his K-9 partner, a German shepherd of unshakable loyalty. Ranger had once dragged Jack out of the rubble of a mortar strike, saving his life. He had lived long enough to return home, gray-muzzled and limping with arthritis, until one spring night when he lay down beneath a magnolia tree and never rose again. Jack buried him there, marking the spot with a modest stone far too small for the weight of his service. From that day on, Ranger's collar never left Jack's pocket, a strip of leather that reminded him that loyalty, once given, was eternal. That morning, Jack walked with purpose because of a notice he had clipped from the newspaper the night before. In between searching job ads he could never qualify for, one advertisement had caught his eye. Abandoned cargo vessel, Harbor Star. Free to qualified applicant willing to tow and dispose. To most, it was worthless, just another derelict rusting into the bay. But to Jack, the word, free, glowed like a lifeline. He had nothing left to pawn, no steady work, no real tools beyond his own strength and stubbornness. Scrap steel could fetch money, enough, maybe, to cover another month's rent, or groceries to stretch his dwindling cupboards. When he reached slip 19, he stopped short. The Harbor Star rose above him like a wounded giant, 300 feet of corroded steel, her hull streaked with rust that ran like dried blood. Barnacles crusted her waterline, moss sprouted through cracked boards along the dock, and gull droppings littered her decks. Once, she had been a proud vessel ferrying cargo across the Atlantic. Now she lingered like a ghost, anchored by neglect, windows cracked, railings bent like tired spines. And yet, despite her ruin, she stood defiant, bow still cutting against the tide as though refusing to surrender. Jack felt an unexpected pull in his chest. He had seen men shattered by war still stand unbent, scarred but upright. The ship reminded him of them. Of himself. He touched Ranger's collar in his pocket, drew a steadying breath, and stepped onto the gangway. Wood groaned beneath his boots as if warning him away. He pressed on, instincts sharpened by years of patrolling hostile terrain. The deck stretched ahead, silent except for gulls. That was when he heard it, a sound that didn't belong. Not gulls. Not water. A whimper. He froze. The sound came again, muffled and low, somewhere below deck. Caution and curiosity pulled him forward. He found a half-open hatch and crouched beside it. A wave of rust and mildew rose up, but beneath it lingered something else. Musk. Fur. A faint metallic scent of blood. Jack descended the ladder, boots clanging on steel rungs, until he stepped into the dim hold. Light slanted through cracks in the hull, thin beams slicing the dark. And then he saw it. A dog lay in the corner, half concealed beneath tarps. A German shepherd, ribs showing through a dust-covered coat, one ear bent sharply. Its eyes, wary but exhausted, locked on him. The right hind leg was raw, torn as if from sharp metal, the wound scabbed but angry. The dog didn't growl. Didn't lunge. It simply stared, chest heaving, silently asking if Jack was salvation, or another threat. Jack's breath caught. In those eyes, he saw Ranger. Not the same dog, but the same fire, loyalty, pain, resilience. He crouched low, voice steady, gentle, the same tone he had once used in Afghan villages, and with Ranger in foxholes. Easy, boy. I'm not here to hurt you. The shepherd's ears flicked, body taut but unmoving. For long moments, man and animal regarded one another in the half-light. The whimper came again, softer now, more like a sigh of surrender. Jack inched closer. The wound was ugly, likely caused by jagged steel. Kneeling, he extended a hand, palm open. The shepherd sniffed once, twice, then lowered its head back onto its paws, still watching. Suspicion. Pain. A question Jack knew all too well. Would this man leave him behind like everyone else? Jack swallowed hard. His hand brushed Ranger's collar in his pocket, gripping it for courage. He whispered again, softer. You don't have to fight alone anymore. The harbor star groaned above them, gulls shrieked outside, and in that forgotten hold, Jack realized he hadn't just found scrap metal. He had found something more, a survivor. A companion. Maybe even the start of a new purpose. The shepherd's amber eyes glistened faintly in the thin beams of light, holding untold stories. And for the first time in months, Jack felt something he thought he'd buried with Clara and Ranger. Hope. Jack couldn't bring himself to leave the dog behind. He stayed crouched in that hold for what felt like hours, speaking in low tones until the shepherd's trembling eased and its wary eyes softened ever so slightly. When the sun dipped low, casting Charleston's harbor in shades of copper and violet, Jack made up his mind. This animal would not be left to die in the belly of a forgotten ship. He coaxed the dog with scraps from his pocket, a half sandwich he had saved from lunch. Bit by bit, the shepherd pushed itself to its feet, limping heavily on the injured hind leg, but following him all the same. Step by careful step, Jack led the animal across the creaking gangway toward his old pickup truck. Up close, he could see the shepherd more clearly, a male, perhaps 6 or 7 years old, with a sable-black coat dulled by dirt but still carrying the strength of fine breeding. One ear was bent permanently at the tip, perhaps from an old fight, and faint scars marked his flanks. But his amber eyes, shot with flecks of gold, were alive, sharp, vigilant, as though every movement in the world was catalogued and judged. This was no ordinary stray. Even half-starved, the dog carried himself with a bearing Jack recognized instantly. The same quiet discipline Ranger once had. At his small rental house a few blocks inland, Jack spread a blanket in the kitchen and lowered the shepherd onto it. He cleaned the wound with antiseptic, hands steady as if back in a battlefield triage. The dog did not whine, did not snap. He simply locked his gaze on Jack, enduring it as if testing whether this stranger was worthy of trust. "You've been through hell," Jack murmured as he wrapped the bandage. When he leaned back, a name rose unbidden, carried by instinct and memory. Valor. The shepherd tilted his head at the sound, as though the word had been waiting for him all along. The next morning, a brisk wind rattled leaves along Charleston's narrow sidewalks. Jack was barely lacing his boots when a knock sounded at his screen door. Outside stood Ruthie Harper, his neighbor across the lane. She was in her early 70s, tall but stooped, hair as white as the morning fog, pinned neatly in a bun. Life had etched deep lines across her face, but her eyes shone with the warmth of someone who had endured much and still chose kindness. Widowed young, her husband lost in a dock accident, she had raised 2 children alone, both long since moved away. Now she filled her quiet days with small acts of care, a loaf of bread left on a doorstep, a jar of stew shared, by accident. She carried a paper bag in her hands, smiling at Jack with that unmistakable southern gentleness. "Morning, Mr. Rowan. Thought you might use a little breakfast." Inside the bag was cornbread wrapped in foil and a carton of milk. Jack gave a sheepish smile. "You don't have to keep doing this, Mrs. Harper." She waved him off with a chuckle. "Don't you go telling me what I do and don't have to. Sometimes the Lord puts us in each other's path for a reason." Her gaze slipped past Jack's shoulder, catching sight of the shepherd lying on the blanket. Her brows rose. "Well now, who's this handsome boy?" Jack hesitated. "Found him on the Harbor Star. Hurt, but tough. His name's Valor." Ruthie crouched beside the dog with surprising agility for her age. Valor lifted his head, eyes wary, but did not growl. "German Shepherd, isn't he? I knew a boy once who worked K9 with the police. Those dogs never forget their training. You take care of him, he'll take care of you." She touched Jack's arm softly. "Maybe this is your sign." Jack tested that thought as the day passed. Valor wasn't like the other strays that haunted Charleston's alleys. When Jack set down a bowl of water, the shepherd waited for a nod before drinking, as if awaiting a command. When a wrench clattered to the floor, Valor stiffened, then held his ground until Jack reassured him. The discipline was unmistakable. Years of training lived inside this dog. Out of habit, Jack gave short commands. "Sit. Stay." To his surprise, Valor obeyed. As dusk settled, a storm brewed offshore, painting the horizon in bruised purples. Jack patched a leak in his roof while Valor paced the small house like a soldier on patrol. When Jack finally lay down to sleep, the shepherd curled at the foot of the bed, eyes fixed on the door, silent and steady. For the first time in months, Jack slept without feeling utterly alone. The peace didn't last. Near midnight, Valor shot upright, muscles rigid, a growl rumbling low in his chest before erupting into sharp, urgent barks. Not fear, but warning. Jack woke instantly, marine instincts firing. Boots on, flashlight in hand, he followed the shepherd to the door. The storm had not yet broken, but the air outside was heavy, the wind thick with the scent of rain. Valor limped quickly down the narrow streets, every muscle trembling with purpose, leading Jack straight back to the docks. At slip 19, the Harbor Star loomed darker than the sky, lightning flashing far out at sea behind her hulking silhouette. Jack's beam swept across the deck, empty, silent, slick with dew. But Valor pulled toward the hatch they had entered before, nose twitching, paws scratching the ground. Jack climbed aboard, heart pounding. Inside, the air felt different. Disturbed. His light revealed tiny signs, a tarp shifted, dust unsettled, a faint footprint pressed into the rust. Someone had been here. Jack's jaw tightened. The harbor star was no longer just an abandoned relic. Someone else was watching her. Someone searching. Valor pressed against his side, hackles bristling, amber eyes burning in the dark. The ship carried secrets. And now, Jack knew he and the shepherd were not the only ones trying to uncover them. Morning crept into Charleston veiled in gray mist, the kind that rose from the harbor like the breath of a weary giant. The air was thick with salt and rust, clinging stubbornly to the skin. Jack Rowan stood at the edge of slip 19, his hands jammed into his coat pockets, staring at the silhouette of the harbor star. The ship loomed against the pale sky, cranes rising around her like skeletons frozen mid-prayer. Behind him, the city continued its rhythms, fishermen loading nets, gulls crying, trucks honking down narrow streets. But here at the far dock, silence pressed heavier than the fog. At his side, Valor limped less than the night before. Jack had brushed the shepherd's coat until it showed a faint sheen, and his amber eyes glimmered brighter with each hour of care. Yet there was still that soldier's vigilance in the way he moved, scanning, guarding, watching. Every few steps he glanced up at Jack, as if confirming his master's resolve. Jack reached down, running his fingers across the shepherd's bent ear. "Guess it's time to see what you've been guarding," he muttered. They crossed the creaking gangway together. The deck glistened with dew, slick underfoot. Jack carried a flashlight and a crowbar, borrowed from Ruthie Harper's shed after she insisted he take whatever he needed. She had appeared at his door at dawn, still in her robe and slippers, eyes grave. "Ships that linger too long," she had said, pressing the crowbar into his hands, "they hold stories. Sometimes those stories don't want to stay hidden. Be careful, Mr. Rowan." Jack had smiled faintly at her words, but he knew she was right. Some secrets fought to stay buried. Inside the harbor star, the sound of Jack's boots echoed against hollow corridors while Valor's claws clicked softly behind him. Dust motes swirled in his flashlight beam, dancing like restless spirits in the stale air. He pushed deeper, memory tugging at him, nights in Afghanistan, patrolling ruined villages under starlight, the silence before an ambush. Out there, the world had been deafening, mortars, radios, heartbeats pounding in his ears. Here, silence itself was the threat, heavy and unnatural, like a battlefield scrubbed clean but still echoing with screams. At one sealed hatch, Valor froze. The shepherd's ears twitched, nose testing the stale air. Jack ran his palm across the metal. Thick seams of welding scarred its edges. Someone had deliberately sealed this compartment decades ago. He pried with the crowbar, but the steel groaned without yielding. "Not today," he muttered, pulling a piece of chalk from his pocket to mark the spot. 2 more hatches along the corridor bore the same scars. Whoever had closed them had intended for them never to be opened again. They pressed on until Jack's light caught something unusual, a rusted iron box wedged between beams in a narrow chamber. Its surface was flaking, but still intact. He wrestled it free, the metal squealing against the steel frame. Valor sniffed, circling the find, then sat with watchful calm, as though recognizing the object held weight but not danger. Jack pried at the corroded latch. Dust billowed as the lid creaked open. Inside lay items that didn't belong in a cargo hold. A wristwatch, frozen forever at 2:17. A leather-bound journal, pages warped but legible. A photograph wrapped carefully in cloth, a sailor in uniform with his arm around a woman and a young boy. Their smiles were wide and weathered, the kind that comes from surviving storms together. Jack stared at the photo, throat tight. He knew that look, the fragile joy of holding on to family when chaos swirled around you. He replaced it gently, almost reverently, as though afraid it might break. The journal drew his attention next. Its script was neat, deliberate, the hand of someone educated but worn by the sea. He skimmed through pages of storms, lost cargo, and the gnawing fear of never reaching home. Then one line made him still. "If we do not return, may whoever finds this carry word to our families. Let them know we stood for one another until the very end. Jack's jaw clenched. He had written letters like that, ones Clara never had to receive. Words meant to bridge the void if death came too soon. He rubbed his thumb over the faded ink, whispering, "I'll make sure someone knows." Valor nudged his knee, sensing the heaviness. Jack scratched behind the shepherd's bent ear, managing a faint smile. "We're not alone down here, buddy." "Not really." But then, movement. A shadow flickered across the thin slit of light from above. Jack froze, extinguishing the flashlight. Darkness closed in, sharpening every sense. Valor stiffened, a low growl vibrating deep in his chest, eyes locked upward. Jack strained his ears. There, a scrape of a shoe on steel. Not gulls. Not the wind. Someone moving deliberately above them. His grip tightened on the crowbar. The harbor star, moments ago a tomb of memory, now felt alive. And Jack realized with cold certainty, he was no longer exploring. He was trespassing. The following morning, Charleston's harbor looked deceptively calm. The storm had passed, leaving puddles that mirrored the wheeling gulls and pale sky. Sunlight brushed faint warmth across the harbor star, though the ship seemed no less haunted, her streaks of rust like dried blood against steel. Jack walked the dock with Valor close at his heel. The shepherd's limp had eased, though he still bore the weight of his wound in every stride. His coat, brushed and cleaner now, caught the light in faint sable streaks. Yet his amber eyes remained sharp, his body always alert, a sentinel tethered to Jack's side. Jack paused at the gangway, staring at the hulking vessel, when a voice rose behind him. "She don't look like much now, but she was a proud lady once." Jack turned sharply, muscles tensing, hand gripping the crowbar he carried out of habit. An older man stood leaning on a polished cane. He looked late 60s, maybe early 70s, his frame lean but unbroken. His face was weathered like driftwood, lined deep with years of salt air. A neatly trimmed white beard covered his jaw, and his blue eyes, unexpectedly sharp, held the weariness of someone who had seen too much fire and brine. He wore a denim work shirt faded from countless washes, a canvas jacket with oil stains ground into the fibers. "I don't believe we've met," Jack said evenly. Valor moved between them, hackles raised, stance taut as a bowstring. The old man lifted a hand, palm open in peace. "Name's Earl Jennings. I worked her engine room, back before she vanished. And I reckon you're the one who signed her out from the city." His voice was gravel and sea air, softened by a Carolina drawl. Jack measured him carefully. "You expect me to believe that?" Earl tapped his cane against the dock. "Believe what you want, son. But I know that ship's bones better than most men know their wives. I patched her leaks, listened to her engines hum. And I'll tell you this, she didn't vanish because of any storm." Jack's frown deepened. "What do you mean?" Earl's eyes shifted to the ship, shadowed with memory. "She carried more than cargo. Quiet runs, never on the manifest. I kept my mouth shut, men like me didn't ask questions. But I'll tell you plain, she's not just steel to cut up. She's history. And not all of it clean." Valor growled low, stepping forward, eyes locked on the stranger. Earl chuckled dryly. "Smart dog. He knows trouble when he sees it." Jack crouched, steadying a hand on Valor's shoulder. "Easy, boy." But inside, doubt coiled in his gut. The old man's words gnawed at him. Jack had seen the photograph, the journal, the plea to be remembered. This wasn't just a shipwreck. It was a story. Yet he also knew his rent was due, bills stacked on the table. He needed money more than mysteries. "Even if you're telling the truth," Jack muttered, "I can't afford to chase ghosts. I need cash, not legends." Earl's gaze hardened, though his tone stayed calm. "You'll have to choose. Strip her bare, or honor what she carried." But either way, men will come for what's hidden. You've already stirred the hornet's nest. Jack's chest tightened at the phrase. He thought of the unsettled dust, the footprint in the rust. Someone else had already been inside. Earl turned, limping away into the haze, his cane clicking against the boards. Before disappearing, he looked back once more. Watch your back. The Harbor Star's got a long memory. And not all her secrets mean to stay buried. Jack carried the warning with him through the day like a burning coal. He tried to focus on patching leaks in his roof, but his thoughts circled endlessly. Should he strip the vessel, take what he could, and walk away? Or should he dig deeper, risking the shadows already circling? That evening he sat on the porch with Valor stretched at his feet. The shepherd's head rested across Jack's boots, eyes half shut but ears twitching at every sound. Jack scratched behind the bent ear. What do you think, boy? Do we keep digging, or cut loose? The dog gave no answer, but his steady gaze felt like one. Jack wasn't as alone in the decision as he thought. That night, the choice was made for him. Jack had barely drifted into uneasy sleep when Valor erupted from his blanket with a snarl. The shepherd was at the door in seconds, barking sharp and urgent. Jack's eyes flew open. He grabbed his flashlight and crowbar, heart pounding as he followed Valor into the damp night. The dock planks rattled under his boots as they raced back to slip 19. The Harbor Star loomed darker than the sky, a hulking silhouette blotting out the stars. Then he saw them, 3 figures crossing the gangway, flashlights darting like nervous fireflies. Hey! Jack roared, his voice cracking across the water. The intruders froze for half a beat, then bolted toward the hatch. Valor lunged forward, his body a streak of fury. He crashed into one man's leg, dragging him down with a yelp. The other 2 scrambled aboard, vanishing into the shadows. Jack sprinted, adrenaline roaring in his veins. He swung the flashlight, catching flashes of movement, a boot, a shoulder, the glint of a crowbar. The man Valor had dropped kicked free and limped after his companions. Jack vaulted onto the deck, Valor right behind him. They chased the pounding footsteps across the steel. The men knew the ship's layout better than they should have. Jack's instincts sharpened into the cold clarity of battlefields past. Near the stern, the sounds vanished. Silence fell heavy, louder than gunfire. They were gone. Melted into the night. But their message was clear. The Harbor Star was no longer his alone. Jack leaned against the railing, chest heaving, Valor pressed tight against his leg, fur bristling. The shepherd's eyes burned at the shadows beyond the dock. Jack tightened his grip on the crowbar. They'll be back, he whispered. And next time, we'd better be ready. Charleston's public library stood like a sentinel from another age. Its brick walls were scarred but proud, its wide stone steps worn smooth by generations of feet. On a damp morning, Jack Rowan climbed those steps with a satchel slung over his shoulder, Valor trotting faithfully beside him. The shepherd's limp had eased further, though his gait still carried the echo of his old injury. His coat gleamed faintly now thanks to Jack's care, but his eyes remained the same, watchful, steady, as if no place was ever truly safe. Inside Jack's satchel lay the sailor's journal, the rusted wristwatch, and the faded photograph. He wasn't sure what he hoped to find, only that the pull of truth felt like a tide, refusing to let him drift away. The library smelled of paper, dust, and polish, a sanctuary of order compared to the Harbor Star's rusted chaos. At the front desk, a young woman looked up from a stack of books. Marcy Dalton. Early 30s, tall and willowy, pale skin glowing faintly under the muted lights. Her auburn hair was pinned in a loose bun, stray strands slipping free as though they resisted any attempt at order. Her green eyes carried a brightness sharpened by intelligence and just a touch of stubbornness. "Can I help you?" she asked, her voice clear but softened with the warmth of someone accustomed to guiding the lost. Jack hesitated. He wasn't a man used to asking for help. But finally, He drew the leather-bound journal from his satchel and slid it across the counter. I need to know if anyone can make sense of this. Marcy studied him for a moment before lowering her gaze. Her fingers brushed the worn leather with reverence, as if she instinctively understood its weight. Where did you find it? Jack's expression stayed guarded. On a ship. He left it at that. Marcy didn't press. Instead, her eyes sharpened with focus. This handwriting looks late 20th century. Merchant marine, maybe naval. Give me a moment. She moved with quick, precise grace to a nearby table piled with reference books and microfilm reels. Jack followed, Valor padding silently behind him. The shepherd circled once and lay at Jack's boots, his body pressed close as though anchoring his master against invisible storms. Jack rested a hand absently on the dog's back, grateful for the solid warmth. For nearly an hour, Marcy pored over the journal's entries, cross-checking with shipping logs, storm records, and brittle newspapers. Her brows knit together, lips moving faintly as she read. Jack watched her, struck by the way she seemed to disappear into the words, her whole being absorbed in the search. At last, she looked up, green eyes glinting with discovery. This matches reports from 1985. Late September. A hurricane ripped the coast. A freighter called the Harbor Star was reported missing offshore. The crew was never recovered. Some thought she went down. Others whispered rumors. But officially, she was lost at sea, presumed destroyed. Jack leaned back, the words hitting like a blow. The Harbor Star wasn't simply abandoned. She had vanished. Swallowed whole by the storm. Her people erased. He thought of the photograph, the sailor, his wife, the boy. So, they were never found. No, Marcy said softly. She touched the photo Jack had pulled from the satchel, running her fingers lightly over its edge. But sometimes the sea keeps secrets for decades before letting them surface. Sometimes they wait for the right hands to uncover them. Jack lowered his gaze to Valor. The shepherd lifted his head, amber eyes steady, as though reminding Jack that fate had chosen him for this burden. Jack felt the old ache stir, the one he carried for Clara, for Ranger's collar worn thin in his pocket, for surviving when others did not. Marcy seemed to sense it. Mr. Rowan, she said gently, sometimes what looks like ruin is really a doorway. Old ships, old wounds, they hide the very lessons God means for us to find. Her words settled deep, quiet but luminous. Jack nodded faintly, clutching the satchel as if it were an anchor. That evening, back in his small house by the docks, Jack opened the journal again under lamplight. Valor lay near his chair, the flicker of the lamp glinting in his eyes. Jack scanned the cramped handwriting until one entry caught him, his pulse quickening as he read aloud. Engines failing. Taking on water. Ordered compartments sealed. If anyone survives, the truth is locked below. Jack read it again. And again. His mind flashed to the sealed hatches he had marked with chalk, weld seams thick with desperation. The answer lay there, in the belly of the ship. Not in relics scattered in boxes, not in rumors, but in the heart of the vessel itself. He grabbed the crude map of the Harbor Star he had sketched from memory, tracing a finger toward the engine room. That was where the truth lay, locked away 35 years ago. Valor stood, ears erect, tail stiff, as though he too felt the gravity of the moment. Jack met the shepherd's amber gaze, steady and alive. "We go back tomorrow," he whispered. Valor answered with a sharp bark, as if in agreement. And for the first time in years, Jack felt something other than grief or weariness. Purpose. Clear and sharp as a blade. The evening sky over Charleston burned orange, shadows stretching long across the docks. The sea looked like molten glass, restless under the coming night. Jack Rowan stood on the deck of the Harbor Star, crowbar resting on his shoulder. At his side, Valor paced, nails clicking against steel, tail stiff with alertness. The shepherd's coat gleamed darker now after weeks of care, though his bent ear gave him the look of a weathered warrior. His amber eyes fixed on the gangway, patient, watchful. Footsteps approached through the mist. Steady. Unhurried. From the haze emerged Earl Jennings. His denim shirt sleeves were rolled up, a tool belt hanging low at his waist. A duffel bag swung from one hand, and in the other he carried a cutting torch. The old mechanic looked carved from driftwood and salt air, his beard white but neatly trimmed, his sun-beaten face lined with decades of storms. "You sure about this, boy?" Earl asked, voice gravel but calm. "Some doors get sealed for a reason." Jack lifted the crowbar, settling it across his shoulder. "That reason's been hidden long enough." Earl studied him, then gave a single, resolute nod. "All right then. Let's see what the ocean tried to keep." They descended into the ship's bowels, air growing damp and metallic, thick with memory. Their flashlights sliced through the dark, beams bouncing off corroded walls. Valor moved ahead, his claws clicking softly, pausing often to sniff the stale air. The sealed hatch loomed at the end of the corridor, its weld seams dull with age, scarred where hurried hands had burned it shut decades ago. Jack ran his hand across the ridges, almost feeling the desperation trapped in the steel. Earl set the torch to the seam. With a hiss, sparks showered like fiery rain, filling the passage with the scent of scorched iron. Valor stood back, hackles raised at the shriek of metal but never taking his eyes from the hatch. Minutes dragged long. The torch carved through rusted seams, until at last the steel groaned and split. Together, Jack and Earl forced the door open, its hinges screaming like a beast disturbed from slumber. Cold air exhaled from the chamber, sealed tight for decades. Their beams revealed a space frozen in time. Dust hung thick, disturbed only by their intrusion. In the center bolted to the deck sat a steel chest, its surface pitted with corrosion but intact. Around it, belongings lay scattered as though dropped in haste, boots, a sailor's cap, a rusted lantern. On the wall, a photograph had survived, men smiling on deck, wind in their hair, faces bright with hope for voyages ahead. Jack's chest tightened. He saw in those smiles the same fragile hope Clara once wore when he left for deployment. The same fire Ranger had carried bounding into danger. Hope carried by people who believed sacrifice mattered. Kneeling, Jack pried the chest open. To his surprise, the lock gave easily. It had been closed, but not as if meant to stay sealed forever. Inside lay a bundle wrapped in oilcloth. Jack unrolled it with trembling hands. A captain's log rested within, along with small keepsakes, a pipe, a compass, a handful of unsent letters. He opened the log. The handwriting was firm, deliberate, even as the words betrayed fear. September 29, 1985. Engines failing. Took on passengers fleeing the storm. Too many for our weight, but to turn them away was to sign their death. Crew sealing compartments to protect them. If we do not survive, may God carry their names. Jack's throat constricted. His vision blurred at the ink. These men had not been smugglers, as the whispers claimed. They had been rescuers. They had laid down their safety to carry strangers through the storm. Earl crouched beside him, lifting one of the brittle letters. His old hands shook. "I knew some of these boys. Worked the docks with M. Lord help me, all these years I thought they deserted, ran from shame. Turns out they gave everything." Jack placed a steadying hand on Earl's shoulder. "Then we'll make sure their story's told right." Valor stiffened suddenly. His ears pricked, teeth baring in a silent snarl. He lunged to the doorway, body rigid, growl vibrating deep. Jack froze, listening. Faint sounds echoed, the scrape of rope against steel, the whisper of boots on deck. Not wind. Not gulls. Intruders. "They're here," Jack hissed. He killed the flashlight, plunging the chamber into darkness. His breath slowed, senses sharpened. Earl pressed against the wall, clutching the wrench he carried. Valor crouched low, body coiled with restrained fury. The fresh edges of the opened hatch betrayed them, gleaming where the torch had burned through. A beam of light slashed across the crack. A voice cursed softly. "They've already found it." Chaos erupted. A figure shoved inside, flashlight blinding. Before he could step fully through, Valor launched. The shepherd collided with him, teeth flashing, dragging him to the ground. The flashlight clattered, spilling frantic arcs of light across the chamber. Jack surged forward, training snapping back into place. He swung the crowbar low, sweeping the intruder's legs. The man crashed onto the steel with a curse. Another figure burst through the doorway, swinging a pipe. Jack twisted, shoulder driving him into the wall. Earl, quicker than his years suggested, swung his wrench with a grunt, knocking the weapon free. Valor fought like a creature possessed, not out of rage, but duty. He held his opponent pinned, snarling, eyes blazing with the same fire Ranger once had. "Get the log out." Jack barked to Earl. But more footsteps pounded closer. Shadows stretched in the doorway. Whoever these men were, they hadn't come alone. The truth inside this chest, the sacrifice of the Harbor Star's crew, was worth killing for. Jack ducked a wild swing, driving his elbow into his attacker's jaw with a crack. Valor dragged his adversary deeper into the chamber, teeth snapping. For an instant, Jack caught the shepherd's eyes, alive, bright, refusing to yield. And in that moment, Jack knew. The Harbor Star was no longer a relic of steel and rust. She was a battlefield, alive with honor and sacrifice. And he and Valor, like the sailors before them, would not surrender. Charleston's harbor had never felt so alive with tension. The clang of the struggle still rang in Jack Rowan's ears as he stood in the shadow of the Harbor Star's rusting hull, chest heaving, crowbar slick in his grip. At his side, Valor pressed close, coat bristling, teeth bared, amber eyes blazing in the dark. Earl Jennings leaned heavily on a rusted pipe, sweat streaking his white beard, his old frame trembling but his eyes still sharp with the stubborn fire of a man who refused to watch history be stolen. Then came the wail of sirens. Red and blue lights slashed through the mist as two police cruisers skidded to a halt at the dock. A third vehicle slowed behind them, an aging Buick, familiar even at a distance. Ruthie Harper's car. The 74-year-old widow hurried toward them, a shawl clutched around her shoulders, gray curls pinned loosely. Her frame looked frail, but her eyes burned with protective resolve. "Jack," she called, her voice trembling between fear and relief. "I called them, I couldn't just sit at home hearing all that racket." Behind her, 3 officers advanced up the dock, led by a broad-shouldered man in his 40s. His hands still bore the grease stains of years spent at his family's auto shop before he'd joined the force. His blue eyes carried the steady patience of someone used to solving problems without a weapon. Sergeant Thomas Whitaker. He raised his flashlight toward the intruders Jack and Valor had subdued, barking an order. "Hands where I can see them." The beaten men hesitated. One lunged toward the rail, but Valor launched with a vicious snarl, snapping close enough to send the man sprawling back against the bulkhead. The shepherd stood rigid, guarding, growl rumbling like thunder. The officers surged forward, weapons drawn, quickly forcing the intruders into cuffs. Jack leaned against the wall, exhaustion draining through him. His voice came rough. "They came for what we found, the captain's log, the crew's belongings." Whitaker studied him, then glanced at Earl and the German shepherd still bristling with fury. He gave a single nod. "We'll sort this out downtown." His tone carried curiosity, not doubt. Ruthie stepped forward, her voice stronger than her frame suggested. "Don't you doubt this man, Thomas. Jack Rowan's no troublemaker. He's a Marine who's carried more grief than most of us could bear. If he says those men came for something on that ship, then you best believe him." The sergeant's expression softened, his respect for her clear. He gestured to his men. Then let's see what was worth a break-in on a rusted freighter. Inside the sealed chamber, Earl guided them to the chest. Whitaker crouched, lifting the captain's log carefully. His brows furrowed as he read the ink-stained pages. The flashlight beam cut across words of storms, overfilled decks, and desperate choices. They weren't smugglers, Whitaker murmured. They were saving families, children. He held up the water-stained photograph of a woman clutching a child wrapped in a sailor's jacket. Silence swept the chamber. Even the younger officers shifted uneasily, as if unseen hands pressed against their shoulders, the weight of lives long gone demanding to be remembered. By morning, word spread faster than tidewater. News vans lined the street near the docks, their satellite dishes jutting like metallic sails. Residents clustered in small groups, faces pale with disbelief, others damp with tears. For decades, the Harbor Star had been whispered about as a ghost ship, a stain of rumor and shame. Now truth rose like the tide. Her crew had not deserted. They had died saving others during the hurricane of 1985. Marcy Dalton arrived at the pier, auburn hair pinned neatly, glasses perched on her nose. She carried a binder stuffed with fresh-printed archives and notes. Her voice trembled with both reverence and urgency as she approached Jack. "The whole story we've carried for years, it was wrong," she said. "The Harbor Star didn't disappear into scandal. She disappeared into sacrifice." She led Jack through the gathered crowd, pointing out records she had uncovered before dawn. Immigrant families missing during the storm. Refugees from Cuba, from Haiti, from coastal towns swallowed by waves. Officially listed as lost at sea. "These artifacts," she said, holding the log tight, "they prove the Harbor Star carried them into the storm's heart. The crew gave their lives shielding them." Jack listened, shoulders heavy. Yet something inside him shifted. For once, he wasn't standing in ruins, he was standing at the threshold of redemption. Not just for himself. For men who had been forgotten for 35 years. The crowd hushed as Marcy's voice carried across the salt air. "This ship isn't a ghost of shame. It's a monument of courage. And we have the chance to finally tell her story." Applause broke, mixed with tears. Neighbors who had once ignored the rusting hulk now touched her railing reverently, as if brushing against sacred ground. Ruthie clasped Jack's arm, her eyes glistening. "See, child. God's been guiding you all along. That ship was never about scrap metal. It was about hope, waiting to be remembered." 6 months later, Charleston's harbor smelled different. No longer of rust and abandonment, but of paint, salt, and renewal. Where the Harbor Star had once loomed like a rotting ghost, she now gleamed in fresh navy and white. Her decks were scrubbed, her railings polished, her broken windows replaced with panes that caught the morning sun. Flags snapped proudly in the coastal wind. Families gathered along the dock in bright summer clothes, children pointing wide-eyed at the ship that had been reborn not just as steel, but as a story. A testament. Jack Rowan stood on the gangway, adjusting the collar of a pressed shirt that felt foreign compared to the patched jackets he used to wear. His posture still carried the discipline of a Marine, shoulders squared, back straight, but his expression had softened. His blue-gray eyes, once hollow with grief, now carried something steadier. In his chest pocket rested Clara's old wedding ring, the talisman of love he had carried through the darkest years. Around his wrist he wore a simple braided bracelet, a gift from a neighborhood girl named Emma, who had made it after hearing the Harbor Star's story in school. At his side trotted Valor, healed and strong. His limp was gone, though a faint scar traced his hind leg. His sable coat shone in the sun, streaked with silver, his bent ear giving him a battle-worn dignity. To Charleston, he had become a hero, the guardian of the Harbor Star. Children sketched him in art projects, newspapers told his story, and visitors often asked about the dog more than the ship. Yet Valor carried his fame humbly, patrolling the deck as if it were still his duty to guard what had been entrusted to him. The crowd swelled with familiar faces. Ruthie Harper arrived in her Sunday best, a pale blue dress trimmed with lace, a small hat perched atop her silver curls. She leaned on the polished cane that had once belonged to her late husband, moving slowly but with a proud smile. Neighbors stopped her along the dock, thanking her for calling the police on that fateful night. She waved the praise aside, murmuring, "I only did what anyone with ears and faith would have done." Marcy Dalton followed, auburn hair gleaming in the sunlight. She wore a formal dress, carrying a leather portfolio stuffed with documents. For months she had worked tirelessly to design the Harbor Star's exhibits. Glass cases now lined the ship's hulls, displaying the sailors' diaries, photographs, and rusted tools salvaged from her belly. Bureaucracy had tried to bury the truth, but Marcy's relentless research had forced Charleston to acknowledge its past. Even Earl Jennings was there, slower now, his beard trimmed neatly, his face thinner but lighter somehow. For decades he had carried the guilt of silence, knowing pieces of the Harbor Star's story but never daring to speak them. Today, he walked aboard not as a ghost of regret, but as a witness to truth finally honored. Jack led the first official tour himself. His voice wasn't stiff like a guide reading from notes. It carried the steady weight of a man who had lived the story he told. He described the first night he stepped into the ship's rusting corridors, the eerie silence, the moment he found Valor in the shadows. Children leaned forward, wide-eyed, as if listening to a legend. He showed them the captain's log, reading aloud the words written as the hurricane bore down, the decision to shield strangers at the cost of their own lives. Mothers dabbed their eyes. Fathers stood straighter. Sons and daughters gazed at the deck with reverence. Valor padded ahead, pausing by each exhibit as if to remind them that courage wasn't just in ink, it was alive in loyalty, in sacrifice, in flesh and fur that endured. When the crowd applauded, Valor lifted his head, tail wagging slowly, regal as though he knew he had become more than a stray. He was a symbol. As the sun climbed, the ceremony reached its peak. A brass band played, their notes floating across the water. A podium stood on the main deck, where officials gave speeches about history, sacrifice, remembrance. But when Jack stepped forward, the crowd hushed. He cleared his throat. His voice wasn't booming like a politician's, but steady, the voice of a Marine who had once whispered promises to a dying wife. "This ship," he began, "was once thought worthless. Rust and ghosts. That's what I thought, too. But sometimes what looks broken is only waiting for someone to see the truth." He paused, scanning the faces before him. The Harbor Star carried men who chose love over survival. They carried families through a storm and gave their lives so strangers might see another dawn. For 35 years, their story was almost forgotten. But not anymore. Jack reached into his pocket. Slowly, deliberately, he pulled out Ranger's collar, frayed leather, tag worn smooth by years of touch. He placed it on a velvet cushion beside the gleaming bronze plaque mounted to the deck. The plaque bore a single line. "For those who chose love over despair, truth over silence." Silence rippled across the crowd. Ruthie dabbed her eyes. Earl clasped Jack's shoulder with a trembling hand. Marcy bowed her head as if in prayer. Valor sat beside the collar, ears erect, gaze fixed on the horizon. For a moment, he seemed to embody both Ranger's memory and his own living legacy, a bridge between past and present, reminding everyone that courage often comes on 4 paws. The band began again, softer this time. Church bells chimed noon from the city beyond the harbor. Jack stood there, his hand resting gently on Valor's back, and realized he was no longer adrift. The Harbor Star had anchored him, not just to a ship, but to faith, to community, to the truth that broken lives could be restored when love and sacrifice were allowed to surface. By autumn, Charleston's harbor no longer whispered of ghosts. The Harbor Star, once a rusting carcass, had become a beacon. School groups filed across her decks, their sneakers clattering against the steel, their voices rising with wonder as they listened to the story of men who had chosen love over survival. Teachers explained how the crew had taken on refugees, how they sealed themselves into compartments so mothers and children might live. Children pressed hands to the glass cases displaying letters, journals, a sailor's cap worn soft by time. Some left flowers at the memorial plaque, petals bright against bronze. On weekends, families came in droves. Fathers lifted sons onto their shoulders to see the view from the rail. Mothers told their daughters about courage, not just in war, but in compassion. Tourists snapped photos, but most left quieter than they arrived, hushed by the weight of sacrifice. Jack Rowan watched it all with a quiet humility. He never stood at the front of the crowds anymore, never sought the spotlight. His part was simple: he had listened, and he had carried the story to shore. That was enough. Most mornings he walked Valor along the docks. The shepherd, healed and strong, trotted with a noble grace, amber eyes alert, as if still guarding the ship from unseen threats. Fishermen saluted him. Children rushed to pet him. Even strangers seemed to recognize Valor as something more than a dog. He was the harbor star's living spirit, a sentinel of loyalty. At night, Jack sometimes sat on the deck alone, the sea wind in his hair. He would touch Clara's ring in his pocket and Ranger's empty collar resting at the memorial, and for once, the ache did not hollow him out. Instead, it reminded him that love, even when lost, could ripple forward, changing the lives of people he had never met. Ruthie Harper came often, too. She brought baked bread for the volunteers, humming old hymns as she walked the deck. The townsfolk treated her as the ship's grandmother, the woman who had first sounded the alarm when shadows tried to claim the harbor star again. She would laugh softly, shaking her head. "I only did what God asked of me. The rest was always meant to happen." Earl Jennings became a fixture as well. Though his steps grew slower with each passing season, he spoke to visitors with the authority of one who had known the ship when she lived. He would tell wide-eyed boys about the engines that once purred like lions, about storms that nearly capsized them, about the camaraderie of men who trusted each other more than they trusted the sea. And always, he would end by pointing to the memorial. "They gave everything. Don't you forget it." Marcy Dalton, for her part, poured herself into preserving the archives. She published a book detailing the harbor star's final voyage, weaving together records, testimonies, and artifacts. It became a bestseller far beyond Charleston, taught in schools as a parable of courage. But she never claimed credit. When interviewed, she always said, "It wasn't me. It was Jack Rowan, and a dog named Valor, who carried the truth out of the shadows." The harbor star changed the city, but more than that, it changed Jack. He no longer woke in the night drenched in sweat, reaching for a rifle that wasn't there. He no longer walked through days carrying Clara's absence like a wound that would never heal. He had found purpose again, not in battle, not in destruction, but in remembering, in rebuilding. One evening, as the sun dipped low, painting the water in strokes of fire, Jack leaned against the railing with Valor at his side. Children ran across the deck, laughing, their voices like music. Ruthie sat on a bench, knitting with steady hands. Earl told stories to a small circle of eager listeners. Marcy stood at the far rail, hair glowing in the sunset, eyes closed as if offering silent thanks. Jack breathed deep, the salt air filling his chest. He turned to Valor, scratching behind the bent ear that had once marked him as broken. "Funny, isn't it?" Jack murmured. "They said this ship was worthless. They said you were just another stray. And look at you now." Valor lifted his head, gaze fixed on the horizon, where sea and sky met in eternal embrace. His amber eyes glowed as though they carried the memory of every sacrifice, every storm survived. Jack followed his gaze, and for the first time in years, he felt no weight pressing him down. Only gratitude. Only peace. The harbor star did not sail anymore, but she carried lives still, teachers, children, veterans, widows, wanderers. She carried them not across water, but across despair, into hope. Her story, like the men who had once braved the storm, became a reminder that broken things could be made whole, that sacrifice could turn grief into light. And at her heart stood a Marine and his dog, two souls once lost, now found. The harbor star would never again be called worthless. She was priceless.